Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply, and this video is to continue the conversation regarding how to measure a mortise cylinder. And the conversation is simply stated, as I did in a much earlier prior video, that the length of a mortise cylinder is measured from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. That's the dimension. I happen to have a mortise cylinder here. This happens to be a Schlage 80-103, which is a small format interchangeable core housing only in a mortise cylinder format. It has a Adams Wright style cam on the back and would be very typical, obviously, for use in an aluminum storefront. Why is this cylinder being used as an example? No reason. It's a mortise cylinder. That's all. All we need is a mortise cylinder that we can measure from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. The 80-103 is listed as 1 3/8. That's the length of the cylinder. Underside of the cam, underside of the head to the back of the cam is 1 3/8. Okay. Now, why is that the length that it is called out as? Is a question that is worthy of scrutiny or further study. However, before we get there, it's important to note that not every manufacturer measures the cylinders in that fashion. Best, for instance, does not measure them, the overall length of the cylinder, from the underside of the head to the back of the cam. This is a 1E74 cylinder, which is like most common mortise cylinder housing probably of all time from Best. It's a 7-pin cylinder that will take a 7-pin. It'll take a 5 or a 6-pin either, but it's meant for 7-pin. And it is the 1E74. If you looked it up in their book, they're going to tell you it's 1 1/4. 1 1/4. Well, where's the underside of the head to the back of the cam? It's quite clearly 1 3/8. In fact, it's slightly heavier than that. But if you study the length of the brass body itself, underside of the head to the back of the brass body, that's 1 1/4. That's their dimension A. So be mindful that for reasons that are yet to be discovered, Best doesn't measure it that way. I've spoken to Best about this, and their answer is we don't know why we do it this way. It would be my guess that the folks at Best who are exceptional when it comes to technical support, in terms of expertise, responsiveness, you name it, they're exceptional. It could be that it's been done this way for a half of a century, and that's the way it's done. It would make sense to me. You could certainly argue, something like, well, yeah, I mean, it's our 1E74. That's 1 1/4 cylinder. Maybe it's got something to do with manufacturing. So the people in the manufacturing plant know how long to cut their brass stock before it's machined. Someone has to do the calculation. So if this cylinder is really meant to be 1 3/8, but they call it 1 1/4, do the people that are cutting the brass to make this care about the length, including the cam? They don't. They want to know how long to cut their pieces. So it could be that as well. I can't think of a reason as it relates to hardware to call it the length of the body only, because what we will discover, I think it can be successfully argued that the overall length of the cylinder is actually more important. The underside of the head to where the back of the cam, as this cylinder relates to the universe that it exists in, meaning not on its own, it's more important to probably know that dimension. Now, if you're talking about this standalone on its own, not relating to any hardware, we can call it anything you want, because we have to call it something. And I might argue that calling it 1 1/4 is really more important, because that's the length of the cylinder. If I'm going to add something onto it, such as a cam, that changes its overall length. Or if I change the shape of the head, let's say if I came up with a giant tapered head or some unusual head thickness, does that change the overall length? No, not at all. Of course it does. What I was trying to say was, does it change the length of the cylinder, underside of the head to the back of the body or the back of the cam? Not at all. Does that change it at all? So what we extend to the back side or what we do to the front side doesn't really change the fact that we're dealing with an 1 1/4 cylinder. But I argue that when you take this and then you force this to play nice with other pieces of hardware, like a mortise lock body, whether it be a mortise lock or an exit device or aluminum storefront or exit device trim, or you're using it as a key bypass on an alarm shutoff, like a single pole double throw key switch. As soon as you say, okay, now I want you to work inside of this greater assembly, now we need to talk about, okay, what is the operating length? And the logic from Best, because they're the only one that I know of that measures it in that fashion. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, without fully understanding the logic of why one manufacturer does it one way and the rest of the industry that I'm aware of does it a different way, it is okay for us as hardware experts, as people who involve ourselves with hardware, because we just have to understand what the definition is and then calculate accordingly. And it's not a coincidence that I selected these two cylinders, because they are the same cylinder by two different manufacturers. They just happen to call it different sizes. The Best catalog says this is 1 1/4. The Schlage catalog says this is 1 3/8. They are the same length, even though they're a little different. But not, I mean, let's get technical. Let's actually measure the length of the body of each. Okay, the Best body is 1.272. 1.272. The Schlage body is 1.269. Okay? 1.272. So 3 thousandths of an inch. For all intents and purposes, these are the same cylinder. The same cam and the same small format is what they are. So I asked a cross-section of the industry, people who are experts. And when I say experts, I actually call these people the most famous people that no one has ever heard of. And that is meant to say that there are giants within our industry, and these people that I have communicated to have been classified by a giant in the industry as giants of the industry. People that I've asked the question, hey, I've been thinking about, why do we measure it this way? And why has it been done this way? And they have all contributed responses to that. And I want to share those responses with you now, just so that we can have an understanding better of why cylinders are measured this way. And I've thought about it myself. And when it comes to defending the Best position, having a background in manufacturing, to the people in the back that are actually cutting the material, they don't care what the length is with the cam. They don't need to. Not that they don't care. It's not germane to what they're doing. Okay. Giving that data to the shop and such, to the plant who's programming a machine or using a compound radial bandsaw, we've got to tell them something. So do you want to tell them, cut it to this size? I need it this size when you're done, or I need it this size to include the cam. You figure it out. And in my experience, not that you don't want calculations being done in the shop, but you need to distill the data to go to the shop in such a way that is like, here's what I need. Make me 400 of these. Make them all 1 1/4. Not make them not make them 1 3/8. Deduct the thickness of the cam. What's the cam? What's the thickness of the cam? I don't know. What am I subtracting? What do I really cut it to? So defending Best. The other side of the coin, though, however, and I believe while the industry does it the way that it is done, is because these don't exist on their own. On its own, it has no importance to us. But when you toss it into a mortise lock or a trim or a key alarm bypass, now it's important to know how it interacts. The way that I do it is I'll take a mortise lock body. When I'm calculating the length of the cylinder that I need, if we're understanding it as the underside of the head to the back of the cam, I'll take my door thickness assuming that I'm putting the lock in the center of the thickness of the door, which don't assume that you are, because you aren't always doing that. And a reason that you're not is, imagine that you have 1 3/4 thick doors, and then your client on the pull side is laying 1-inch fabric panel everywhere. And that door is going to kind of disappear into the wall to a certain extent. So your lock body is now not centered in the 2 3/4. You've got 1 3/4 door and a 1-inch panel, but that cylinder needs to come through. So your lock body is no longer centered. I've also done projects for people where they were building 3-inch thick gates for the High Line in New York, the reclaimed space, elevated train areas, gates, where they had 3-inch thick gates, and they weren't centering the lock body in the bottom of that 3-inch steel tube because of the way that the bolt would interact with what the condition was at the sill. So understanding the door thickness is important, but that's based on, is the lock in the center of the thickness of the door? Don't assume that it is, because it may not be. But if it is centered in the thickness of the door like it usually is, I take the door thickness and I cut that in half. So 1 3/4 divided by 2 is going to, of course, be 7/8 of an inch. And at that point, I just, of course, said 7/8 of an inch, and that's important to note, that not every door is actually 1 3/4. And I don't want to really derail, but if you take your caliper and you put it on a fire-rated wood door, it's 1.71 or something like that. It's not 1.75. If you take a 14-gauge steel stiffened hollow metal door and you put your caliper on it, it's not 1 3/4. It's going to be 1.875. So when you're dealing with standard doors, standard hollow metal, standard architectural wood doors, 1.75 I think is good. But when you are dealing with a door that you say to yourself, wow, that's a cool door, maybe put the caliper on it, because that calculation could change what you will order your cylinder at. So 1 3/4 divided by 2 is 7/8. Okay, so my cam needs to come to 7/8 to be in the center of the door, but I usually will shave it back 1/16 or 1/8 of an inch because of the possibility of doing this. Double cylinder aluminum storefront, which is not really common, but I want to be able to have a small margin between my two cams so that they operate. No more than 1/8 of an inch, no less than 1/16 is my rule of thumb. So now you know the thickness of the door, you're centering it, cut that in half, 7/8, take off 1/16. Okay, so you're really dealing with a 13/16 cylinder, quite short. Then you're going to add whatever you're installing that through. Cylinder collar, cylinder ring, escutcheon trim. It's sitting into an exit device trim. It is an alarm bypass where there's going to be a collar. At that point, you say to yourself, okay, how much longer does my 13/16 now have to grow because of what I'm sticking it through? How thick is that? Add that dimension. And if you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, I'm at 1.125. Well, in the case of Schlage, I think they include a 7/16 blocking ring. So let's just say I'm at 1.116, and Schlage is packing this with a 7/16 blocking ring. Why? Because it's 1 3/8. Why? Because that's the shortest they make this in. Why? Because of what you're sticking into it. So for an 1 3/4 thick door, it's very likely you're going to need a 7/16 blocking ring, because you can't get a 7-pin compatible shorter than 1 3/8 because the cylinder itself is too long to fit into anything shorter than that. And I do understand from one of our giants of the industry that it's a downside with best, because some people don't like how long their cylinders are. Understood. I don't either. You're adding lots of blocking rings. Why? Because you have a 7-pin interchangeable, small format interchangeable core system installed. So that calculation is of how long your cylinder needs to be is done when you're putting this in context of the rest of the things it needs to work with: the lock, the door thickness, how thick you're sticking it through, okay, and the function of the lock, what will potentially come in contact with this. That's all going to conspire to say how thick you need something to be. Now, in the best example, what's the one piece of information I'm missing? I'm missing the thickness of the cam, which is about 1.3 inch, just heavy on 1/8 of an inch. But if you use that logic and you're saying 1.25 inches for best, does that really get you to where you need to be to understand this cylinder in its greater context? I'm going to argue that no, it doesn't, because if you're thinking that it's 1 3/4 and you have a double cylinder application and you're calculating your thickness of your trim rings based on what you're sticking it through, a cylinder collar, a ring, a trim, a rose, an escutcheon, whatever, I don't know that it's the shortest path to get to where you need to be to order your length of your mortise cylinders. I don't think that there's any excuse to not being able to calculate that, because, you know, if that's 0.13 inch on thickness of the cam, you can calculate that, because you're still coming to those two, you know, a cylinder being in the center of the lock and then shaving it back a little bit. So let me read to you 3 answers that I've received, giants of the industry. And I'll tell you this, as a commercial, as a advertisement, the Door Hardware Institute and ALOA, ALOA.org. I want to make sure that that's correct. I know it is. ALOA.org is definitely what it is. It is the national organization as it pertains to the locksmithing industry. And there are lots of people, by the way, the Associated Locksmiths of America is what it stands for. A lot of people are in the locksmithing business. There are franchises of locksmithing businesses, and many people call themselves locksmiths. There are people who have written textbooks on locksmithing, and it does not appear that they hold an industry credential that would be assigned by ALOA, like a CML, Certified Master Locksmith. So you have people who are locksmiths but don't participate and might be at the beginning of their career, and then you have people who write textbooks who may not participate. I don't know that, but don't have the credential. So I'm thinking, well, if they're going to possess the knowledge, why not get the credential? And then the Door Hardware Institute, of which I participate in both. The relationships that you forge through these two organizations are the very exact reason why there are people that I can tap their shoulder and say, excuse me, would you please give me your opinion or educate me, teach me about how this works. And without ALOA and DHI, there would be no access to these folks. You would never know of them because they're the most famous people no one has ever heard of. So possibly the largest manufacturer of cylinders in North America, in the United States anyway, has said, and there's kind of two parts to this. The operating parameter of the cylinder can't include the head because it bottoms out on the cylinder or trim and is not part of the penetration of the cylinder into the lock. So what this gentleman is saying is, don't include the head. It doesn't come into play. It really doesn't, whether it be a weird tapered head or square head, whatever you've got. Now here's the meat of it. The cam is included because it is inside of the operating parameter of the cylinder. Pardon me. The cam is included because it is inside of the operating parameter of the length. In other words, the depth at which the cylinder penetrates a lock has to include the cam to judge that the cam operates in the sweet spot of the mortise lock or approximately in the middle of the throw lever that operates the bolt. So the throw lever is the yoke that the cam will come through and kick back and forth to lock and unlock your unit. So what they're saying is, what he's saying is, I need to know the cam because that's part of the totality of what the job is the cylinder's doing. I need to know where that is. Yeah, and yes, I think we can all say that that's correct. A gentleman who is a giant in the industry, he is the head, I believe the head technical person at a manufacturer of locks that has been in business for decades, and they're known to be the company who, when no one else can make it, these folks can probably make it. And in fact, I've had this company make me 2 mortise locks maybe 10 years ago that were to operate the Access to the air traffic control tower at the International Airport in Qatar in the Middle East. These locks had to have 2 keys for access. So like a setup key and then an operating key, like you would have in a safe deposit box. But you've seen it in the movies. You need 2 keys to arm the missiles. These locks required 2 keys to gain access. This company could make them. So this gentleman says, I think to select the right cylinder length that integrates with the hardware, takes into account the door thickness. The most important things to know are how far the end of the cam engages into the lock and where the cylinder head will be in relation to either the hardware it sits on or the door itself if you're not using a collar. The end of the cam to the underside of the cylinder head gives you that information so that you can calculate based on the rest of the inputs. It is also the opinion of this gentleman that it is true, Best has not manufactured commercial hardware for as long as Schlage or certainly Yale and Corbin and Sargent. By comparison to Sargent, Corbin, Russwin, and Yale, Best is a newcomer in the industry of manufacturing hardware. And in fact, I believe that they had, don't quote me, but maybe Falcon made locks for them, and they had an agreement, but eventually they got into lock manufacturing. And it's the supposition of this gentleman that maybe Best just didn't know. I would imagine that they probably knew, because like Frank Best himself, who patented the small format cylinder he came up with the idea in the early 19-teens, applied for patent in 1919 and was awarded the patent in 1921. When you look at the patent for the small format core, there's no chance that, in my opinion, he was not aware of everything else that existed in the industry, and in particular mastering by P.F. Corbin, because there's a similarity there based on the existence of ball bearings. So I would think that Best really knew what was going on, and I like the idea of them needing to qualify it as some size, and that they did it based on internal reasoning. The third answer that I have is from another giant of the industry who worked for, a company that's been manufacturing locks for, I think next year will be 100 years, and is responsible for technology that we all use every single day. And his answer is, the back of the flanged end of the mortise cylinder to the back of the cam is the dimension that you need for door thickness calculations. For example, to check that the cam reached the middle of the mortise lock, or that 2 mortise cylinders don't bump into each other in double cylinder applications, is why you want to know that. Basically what he's saying is, if you don't know that length, you can still calculate it, but you still need to know the length, the thickness of the mortise of the cam. And he goes on to say, I don't know why Best does it differently, but if I had to guess why, he would say that maybe perhaps they don't want to convey the actual length of the cylinder because it's considered an objection to certain folks. Hey, I want my 7-pin technology in small format interchangeable core, of which Best is the name synonymous with that. But I don't want the cylinder to be so long. We can't have both. You don't want the cylinder to be so long, get a thicker door. Okay? So, however that's going to be. So that's his supposition. And again, 3 giants of the industry that, are incredibly gracious with their answers and their time. And it's my involvement with, in this case, Aloha. Well, both really, both. But Aloha, when it comes to locksmithing stuff specifically, back to the commercial, you'll want to, in my opinion, be a member of Aloha. And take classes or be participating, because you will meet the most famous people no one has ever heard of. So that's the my 2020 take on how to measure a mortise cylinder. I think the only thing you have to be sure is of the lock that you're dealing with is the sweet spot, as one of the gentlemen said, the center of the lock. And I can't think of a lock where it's not, except, well, yeah, you kind of can. There are sweet spots. The center of a mortise lock to throw the throw member to draw the latch or bolt. But if you have an alarm bypass and an exit device, there is a tail piece, so to speak, that is coming off the micro switch, so that when you throw the key back and forth, you're either engaging that micro switch or you're not. So the length of the cylinder you really have to know, because the sweet spot does exist, which isn't the center of anything. The same with a surface-mounted alarm that will have a magnetic, sort of reed switch contact happening. You can only have so long of a mortise cylinder before it will bottom out to the back of the lock, and then you need to add trim rings to all of that. So knowing what the sweet spot is, as a term that one of these three gentlemen has coined for me, knowing where your sweet spot is important to know as well, because let's not assume we're just dealing with a grade 1 mortise lock where you can be in or out 1/8 of an inch, and it's probably going to be okay. And as I've learned through DHI, and I've learned through life experience, whether or not I intended to know it, and it has been said to me by one of the instructors, a Canadian gentleman who works in Nova Scotia. His whole thing was read the installation instructions. You're someone who works in the door hardware industry. Read the installation instructions. Study the templates. You want to take that to another level, go out in the back in the shop and learn how to prep doors. And then you're going to understand why things are important the way that they're important. If you have any questions on how to measure mortise cylinders, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. My name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply. And to those giants of the industry, the most famous people no one has ever heard of, I deeply am grateful for my ability to be able to tap you on the shoulder. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up, please subscribe, and maybe even send the video to someone that you know. Thank you.